Every day that goes by, it feels like there's a new controversy in the world of gaming. One day we're up in arms about Nintendo's business practices and pricing models, then the next day we forget about it because we're trying to organize against Visa and MasterCard influencing what games are sold on Steam. And I mean, we literally forgot about Nintendo because the Switch 2 has already become the fastest selling new console in the history of America. With so much commotion and so little justice, honestly, I've lately started to long for a simpler time in gaming. A time where the only two controversies were A, how much sex and violence there could be in a particular game, and B, whether it was unironically okay to choose Bulbasaur as your starter Pokemon. The answer is yes, it's just that a dinosaur with a flower on its back is simply not as cool as a dragon or a turtle with a cannon in its shell. As I was reminiscing on these glory days, I found myself questioning whether any controversy in the modern era could ever surpass the old ones, due to how many there are and how quickly we forget them. Then, from this line of questioning, I started to ask myself, what is the most controversial video game in history? What game caused the biggest uproar amongst gamers and our global culture? What game had the biggest impact on our collective legal systems, on the way games are made? There are a lot of perfectly valid candidates, but if I personally had to pick one game that truly set off alarms across every level of society, politicians, the media, and even the game developers themselves, it would be Manhunt 2. Now, before I go into greater detail, I think it would be best to address what I imagine will be a couple of the counter-arguments right off the bat. What about Mortal Kombat and its violence? It was so controversial that it birthed the ESRB. What about that little franchise called Grand Theft Auto, particularly GTA San Andreas, with the whole hot coffee debacle? Perfectly valid, and they definitely belong in the top 5 or 10. But here's why I think they fall just a bit short. In respect to both franchises, their controversies have long since fizzled out. They are now both beloved, and in the case of the upcoming GTA 6, it is arguably the most anticipated video game ever made. As for the individual games in those franchises, the first Mortal Kombat wasn't the only game that birthed the ESRB. It was a combination of it, plus games like Doom, Night Trap, and other violent video games that created this general mistrust amongst our politicians and concerned parents. And with San Andreas, hot coffee was a sex minigame that was never meant to be seen or used. It was blown way out of proportion, because it required players to mod the PC version of the game just to access it. The game itself has sold roughly 20+ million copies, and is generally understood to be one of the greatest games ever made. Now, by contrast, the controversy surrounding Manhunt 2 never seemed to be resolved. The amount of violence in this game is so dense, and the tone of the game is so bleak and sadistic that it created a prolonged philosophical battle which haunted the game through its development, to its release, and beyond. This wasn't just among the politicians and parents. Even people who are fans of the first Manhunt game question whether the sequel went too far. In other words, where specific aspects of Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto were controversial at one point, the entirety of Manhunt 2 has remained controversial since its release. Today, I want to look back at what happened with this game, determine whether the controversy was justified, and of course, whether the game itself was any good. Before I do, I want to acknowledge that because of this video's subject matter, there's a possibility it might get demonetized, even though I'm going to present it in what should be an advertiser-friendly way. Nonetheless, to help bolster me against that possibility, please consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my YouTube membership section, where you can gain access to various perks and privileges. I will leave links to that in the description box below. Now, let's start by diving into the history of Manhunt 2's development. Any discussion of Manhunt 2's controversy needs to take into account the hubbub surrounding the first game and the developers producing it. For a time, Rockstar Games were the bad boys of the game development scene, trying to push the boundaries of what type of subject matter they could put into their games and get away with. Killing innocents in Grand Theft Auto, getting into fistfights with other kids in Bully. Yeah, those are the same thing, Max. But Manhunt 1 was arguably the apex of their mischievous design philosophy. The plot of that game centered on a criminal who was supposed to die on death row, but had his death faked so he could become an unwilling participant in a snuff film ring. The director of that film ring instructed him to kill people as violently as possible while he filmed it, so that he may obtain his freedom. Then, for the next several hours, the gamer had to kill people using the game's infamous execution system, which rewarded people based on how brutal their killings were. Now, while I and many others would argue that the game provides more than enough context and artistic merit for this disturbing scenario, it is perfectly understandable why people might struggle to see that at first. Hell, even some of the developers had a crisis of conscience over Manhunt 1. A former Rockstar producer said that there was almost an internal mutiny at Rockstar because of how the game's violence made them feel icky, and in his opinion, lacked rational justification. This perspective was easier to adopt for people with only a superficial impression of the game. Several United States politicians condemned the game for supposedly encouraging real-life violence, including the most formidable Karen in the history of video games, Jack Thompson, who aggressively tried to get the game banned. Though he failed miserably in America, several other countries either banned or refused to rate the game, including New Zealand, Australia, Germany, and even my home country of Canada. It became such an easy scapegoat for people to connect to real-life violence that there was one murder case in the UK that tried to blame Manhunt for the event. Supposedly, a 17-year-old was inspired by the game to kill a 14-year-old, but the actual truth of the matter, as it was found out in court, is that it was actually the victim who had the copy of the game, not the murderer, rendering any connection to the game superfluous, to put it lightly. Despite this, it didn't stop the parents of the victim from blaming Rockstar, nor did it stop Jack Thompson from trying to advocate on the parents' behalf, willfully ignoring who owned the copy of the game in order to bolster his narrative. Ultimately, the game did get reclassified, and it was sold in a number of countries, with the controversy ironically boosting the game's sales. Today, it is viewed as a cult classic, and a shining example of the time when Rockstar didn't just make Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption, but experimented with a variety of genres that led to some of their best work. However, it's somewhat of a different case when it came to Manhunt 2. A month after Manhunt 2 was announced, Jack Thompson filed a lawsuit to block the game's release on the basis that it and the soon-to-be-released Grand Theft Auto 4 were, quote, public nuisances. On top of this, and I swear to God what I'm about to say isn't a joke, Jack Thompson accused Rockstar's producer, Take-Two Interactive, of violating the RICO Act. Now, RICO, for those outside the US that don't know, is the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And who did Jack Thompson accuse Take-Two of racketeering with in order to publish the supposed public nuisance? The entire games media industry. IGN, GameSpot, Eurogamer, Kotaku, GameSpy, the literal Entertainment Software Association were all racketeering to promote Manhunt 2 so they could profit from corrupting the moral fabric of America. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all question the ethics of mainstream gaming journalism, but I think we can all agree that neither they nor anybody has the collective IQ for that kind of conspiracy. Now, it would be one thing if this Giga Karen actually believed what he said and wasn't grifting for money, but given that he settled the lawsuit and promised to never sue over Take-Two's games ever again, let's just say I have my doubts. Now, in case my commentary on the matter hasn't made it obvious, I do believe that it's okay that Manhunt 2 exists and that it should be sold. It's a video game. It's not real life. And there have been numerous studies time and again that disprove any linking between criminal acts depicted in video games and real life. However, this isn't to say that I don't see some of the controversy surrounding this game as reasonable, even if I disagree with most of the reasoning. The first Manhunt was rated M for mature in America, and was rated 18 in the UK, despite all the controversy surrounding it. But Manhunt 2 was the second game in American history to be rated adults only purely because it was so violent. In the UK, the game was outright refused classification because of how violent it was. Both the British and the Irish didn't even believe that any cuts or censorship could make the game safe for sale, at least initially. This didn't stop Rockstar from attempting to do so though, because if they couldn't get their game rated, they couldn't sell it. This goes for America as well. Games that are rated adults only in America aren't sold on consoles, which rendered the game effectively banned in the land of the First Amendment. Though they were ultimately successful in censoring the game so it could be released in their two most lucrative markets, it wasn't without continuous resubmission and pushback from politicians. In America, several prominent politicians, including Hillary Clinton, wrote an open letter to the ESRB asking for Manhunt 2 to be re-rated to adults only, which the ESRB refused, and in my opinion, rightly so. In the UK and the broader European Union, the game was released a year after it came out in America, following multiple refusals from the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, and a year-long court battle against the Video Appeals Committee. Now, because the game was ultimately determined to be safe for distribution by these review boards, one might expect that the controversy would stop there, that the overzealous and overly concerned politicians and parents could let the gamers have their fun. Interestingly though, I found that even people who played the game, and even people who like the game, question its artistic purpose. And in one very specific respect, I have to admit, I question the game as well. To explain what I mean, I will cite the BBFC's original justification for refusing Manhunt 2's classification. Though I ultimately disagree with their initial conclusion and most of their argumentation, the one possible exception is that the game has a, quote, different overall narrative context compared to the first Manhunt. As I already said, encouraging the gamer to kill people as brutally as possible is contextualized by the main character's circumstance as an unwilling participant in a snuff film ring. In addition, the more the story unfolds, the clearer it becomes that the game is actually a dark satire of violent media. It's meant to make the gamer reflect on the bleak meaninglessness of everything that is happening, and in turn, hopefully, make them question why they're playing the game in the first place. In that sense, it succeeds as well, if not better, than games that tackle the same subject, games like Hotline Miami or Spec Ops: The Line. With Manhunt 2, the only thing that carries over from the first game is the execution system. There is nothing about the story of Manhunt 1 that is consistent in the sequel, and the new story that we get does nothing to contextualize that level of violence. This is especially the case, ironically, with the censored version of the game. At least with the uncensored version, the gamer can blame their sadism on the fact that they're trying to get a high score at the end of the level, just like in the first Manhunt. But in Manhunt 2, one of the things the game did to get uncensored was to remove the rating system. Yet in doing that, you now take away any story-based and gameplay-based justification for trying to get the most brutal kills. Now, it's just violence for the sake of violence, which, in effect, made Manhunt 2 the very thing that the first game was trying to criticize. With this said, does this justify banning the game? In my opinion, no. Does this alone make enjoyment of Manhunt 2 unacceptable? No, not at all. But does it make at least a bit of the controversy earned, and the initial adults-only rating partially understandable? Kind of, yeah. At the very least, I think it's a large reason the game's controversy remains unresolved. Not only that, I think it's a large reason why the game is so hard to access nowadays. As far as I'm aware, there's only 3 ways you can play the game. If you have an original copy, if you buy a digital copy on the PlayStation 3, or if you go through an abandonware website to play it on PC. Granted, you can emulate the game, but it is famously difficult to get into a functional state. For these reasons, I think Manhunt 2 is unique amongst many controversial games. Where so many are controversial for either made-up reasons or elements that are blown way out of proportion, Manhunt 2 earned at least a bit of its reputation. And because of this, it made a significant impact on our global legal systems, culture, and gaming as an art form. But is the game worth playing? Let's finally put aside whether the game should be considered controversial or not, and actually talk about the game's quality. In my opinion, Manhunt 2 is fine. Yeah, it's fine. Would I recommend it? Sure. I think if you're like me in that you can tolerate the levels of violence and their lack of context, there's enough enjoyment and artistic merit with Manhunt 2 that it can be appreciated by any lover of horror media. That said, I think it not only falls short of the first game in almost every conceivable way, I think it's fair to say that for some people, the most shocking thing about Manhunt 2 is that it's a bit of a blunder compared to Rockstar Games' stellar back catalog, where almost every major game they put out is a 9 or 10 out of 10. Manhunt 2 is like a 7. Now, on my 1 to 10 scale, a 7 out of 10 is a good game. But when stacked against all of these legendary titles, Manhunt 2 sticks out like a sore thumb. Well, there is table tennis, but come on, does that really count? Anyway, let's start with the things that the game does right. First, the tense stealth action gameplay is mostly preserved in the sequel, and in a couple of circumstances, it's improved. One big improvement, in my opinion, is the way the firearms handle. Several times when I played the first Manhunt, I dreaded using the guns because they often felt very imprecise, even when playing on PC where I could be more accurate with my aiming. Sure, part of it is because the game is trying to encourage you to use a stealth melee approach most of the time, and making guns easy to use would detract from the tension. But there were still entire levels that mandated use of firearms, which made the tricky handling more frustrating than tense. Typically, I found myself reloading the gun-focused levels like 5 to 10 times, whereas with the other levels, I at most had to reload them only once or twice. With Manhunt 2, that is no longer a problem because the firearms have a great lock-on system that always felt fair. Better yet, it didn't take away from my feeling of vulnerability that I had in the first game. Sure, it makes it easier to be lethal with firearms, but there were enough random variables at play to always keep me on my toes. When something went wrong and I got caught, or when I thought I had cleared an area only for bad guys to come out of nowhere behind me, I always felt that jolt of joyous anxiety. Though beyond what I personally view to be an improvement to the guns, there's not much else that's new or commendable with the gameplay. I mean, sure, you can break lights in order to make it easier for you to hide in the shadows. There's a button prompt you occasionally need to press if an enemy is looking for you in the shadows and you don't want to get caught. But these and other additions to the core gameplay that should have been dynamic really just feel like window dressing. They genuinely would make no difference if they were taken out. Despite this almost complete lack of innovation, this if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality nonetheless carries the game through its entirety. The overall technical presentation is solid. Not amazing, but still good, especially when you consider that the game released 2 years into the 7th console generation and was going up against games like Halo 3, BioShock, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare, while also being relegated to generally lesser hardware, save for the PC. The music, art direction, graphics, and sound design are all generally effective in recapturing the first game's atmosphere. Not always. The stages in the second half of the game are pretty generic if I'm being honest, but the first half of the game features some levels that transcend the first Manhunt in terms of how dingy, dreary, yet transfixing they can be. The one exception in regards to the technical presentation, though, is that I found the voice acting in the second game to be a bit lackluster. Where virtually all major Rockstar games tend to have stellar, iconic voice acting, especially with Brian Cox's performance as the main villain in Manhunt 1, the line delivery in Manhunt 2 often felt very hokey. Yet while it was often noticeable, I will admit it didn't significantly detract from my overall experience. Now the story. Without spoiling anything, I think that on a conceptual level, Manhunt 2's story is strong. The ideas behind what Rockstar were trying to do are not only very interesting, they are somewhat progressive. The two main characters in this game, Daniel Lamb and Leo Casper, are suffering from a form of psychosis. The nature of that psychosis and what brought it about are both really interesting, and honestly somewhat innovative. Where other games like Outlast, Visage, or the aforementioned Spec Ops and Hotline Miami tackled very similar subject matter, Manhunt 2 got to it first, and in a couple of respects, the horror of dealing with their mental conditions is presented in some genuinely chilling ways that really got under my skin. Plus, some of the initial mystery regarding these two characters and how they ended up in their present circumstances was pretty effective. But unfortunately, aside from this, I feel that the story of Manhunt 2 takes a potentially brilliant concept and squanders it via a combination of what seemed to be both incompetence and, honestly, laziness. Now, I can't explain why without diving into spoilers. If you have not played Manhunt 2 and want to experience its story fresh, please skip ahead to the timecode you see on screen now. You have been warned. So, we learn that Daniel Lamb was both a scientist and test subject in a government program called the Pikmin Project. The aim of this project was to create a brain implant that could contain all the qualities and personality of a perfect assassin. Then, after putting that brain implant into another person's brain, the two personalities could be switched on and off through the use of hypnosis techniques to ensure that if an enemy agent or country captured an American assassin, the assassin personality would be turned off, and the likelihood that the enemy would gain any valuable intel through interrogation or torture would be impossible. As I said, very interesting idea conceptually. Moreover, I really appreciate the game's attempts to link this to the very real mind control experiments undertaken by the CIA, most famously known as MKUltra and conducted between 1953 and 1973. However, the actual implementation of this idea resulted in many things that make absolutely no sense to me. If the idea is to make Daniel Lamb, the civilian personality, and Leo Casper, the cold, calculating assassin, can somebody explain to me why Leo acts like a zany, psychotic hype man for the majority of the game?
Brutal, Danny, brutal! No time to rest, Danny. Show him who's in control! That's the best you can do?
In other words, why would you want somebody who's supposed to be as clean and effective as Hitman's Agent 47 to act like Trevor from Grand Theft Auto 5?
No, I really don't.
Do you want me to get my dick out again?
And if you're going to do that, why not at least use it to contextualize the gameplay? Here's an idea. If you're going to include the execution system, why not make it so that the more brutal the killings are, the more Daniel's sadistic alternate personality is appeased? If he doesn't, then maybe reality can start to break down around him, similar to a game like Eternal Darkness or Amnesia. That would not only get closer to executing on the premise's full potential, but would make for a more interesting and innovative gameplay loop and add a deeper dimension to the horror. But no, it's like they were too lazy to even consider this. And speaking of laziness, the ending is terrible. Sure, there was a second ending in the original uncensored version, one where Leo takes over Daniel's mind, but it was removed because in order to get it, you had to kill a bunch of civilians, which the ESRB and BBFC considered a big no-no. So the ending that most people got was the one where Daniel destroys his alternate Leo personality in a dreamscape. But unfortunately, doing so also causes him to forget he was Daniel. Upon waking up, he is given a new identity where he can go and live a happy life. The reason why this pisses me off is because the ending is played off as a good thing, that Daniel is finally freed from his tormented psyche and gets to live the rest of his life in peace. It's like, no, he willingly facilitated this evil government project and killed hundreds if not thousands of people. So like, why are we making him out to be the victim? Even if all of these problems were addressed, I'm still not sure that the story Rockstar was going for would have been the appropriate one. After all, the first game created this surprisingly rich mythos surrounding Carcer City, the gangs, the snuff film ring, and the twisted psyches they all produced, especially with the character of Pigsy. There was so much room to expand upon that and use it to do what Rockstar games do best, which is darkly satirize American culture. Maybe the second time around, society would degrade even further, and instead of an underground film ring, it's an underground battle royale that's framed as a game show. And next up we got Lou Scary, host of our primary competitor, Whose Lynching Is It Anyway? My favorite game on there is Scenes from a Hatchet. Right you are. Oh! And once again, Daniel Lamb blows away the competition. Now he just has to kill that guy from The Slice Is Right and Who Wants to Be a Killionaire? Right you are. Manhunt 2 is a fascinating game, though not necessarily because of its actual content. What makes it compelling is both what it had the potential to be, and even more so, the widespread misconceptions about what it actually is. Of all the controversy it sparked, its most controversial element wasn't necessarily the brutality, but the conversation it sparked about censorship, creative intent, and the limits of artistic expression in interactive media. For that reason, Manhunt 2 has to be considered one of the most controversial video games ever made. But I want to hear from you. Have you played Manhunt 2? Are you somebody that really appreciates the game? Let me know in the comments section below. Make sure to give this video a like, and if you like what I do here, make sure to subscribe for more video game analysis. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.